Welcome to the Wandering Road Podcast, Creepy Edition. On today's show, I am joined by one of my best friends, Aaron, to discuss his paranormal and supernatural experiences. Aaron, welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you on. How are you?
Chris, I'm doing great. Happy to be here. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well, man. It's a little rainy and gloomy out my way, but I guess that sets the perfect setting for what we're going to be discussing today.
I mean, could you really get a better setting for doing a creepy podcast than gloomy, foggy? I mean, all we're missing is just because of daylight savings is some of this darkness. But hey, other than that, we got great conditions.
Oh, absolutely. So we were chatting a little bit before the pod and a few days ago, and I told you my idea of delving into paranormal podcasting and creepy podcasting. And we've talked about this stuff before when we hung out and like to go to battlefields and stuff like that. Yes, folks, we are both history majors. We both went to school for history at university when it comes to that. And in our trips, we've talked about paranormal stuff, paranormal experiences. I've definitely shared some stuff with you, but you let me know that you haven't told me everything.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that I've heard so many stories from you, but never realized that I never got a chance to share anything. So that's why I'm really excited to be able to share, some of my stories that I've gone through. The one that I tell frequently for, anybody who grew up in my area, went to high school with, or kind of knows, the region that I'm talking about. So back in high school, me and a couple friends, there were four of us, or four others, so five of us in total. And I don't mind naming the place. People from the region will know what it is, but others probably won't know too much about it. But there's a historical church where I grew up. It's called Quaker Cemetery, Quaker Church, Quaker Cemetery. And to give you a little bit of background on this, the church has been around since the 1700s. It actually predates the American Revolution. So it was, around at the time of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as we call it here in the States. So even before that, it's been around for quite a while. And folklore that goes around this place is that over the years, the Quakers used to meet there. Witches would gather in the woods. Just satanic groups would have gatherings, once or twice a month. Because if you kind of approach this, it's off of a main road, but it's off of a side road, kind of an extension of that road in itself. So as you're going up to it, it's kind of hidden if you don't know where the roads are. And it is hidden back there. So really, it's a perfect setting to be able to have groups or cauldrons or whatever you may want to call it meet back in the woods behind this place. So, me and my friends, we used to go up there, I would say around Halloween time every year. And this one night, it's funny, we were talking about rain and fog and everything. It was a little misty out that night. It had rained. So we all pull up towards the cemetery, but there's no parking lot. So we actually had to park about a quarter of the mile down the hill and walk up the road. So we get up, and there's these gates that, kind of outline the cemetery from the road. So we walk in, and the first thing you see is the old church. It's just this big brick stone building. There's nothing inside of it and no doors, so you can walk right in. But if you walk around the old church, there's actually some tiny graves, like hit or miss, just right around the church. And that's kind of where the story gets interesting. So one of my buddies, decided he had to relieve himself on the side of the church. And he just goes over, and he happens to be standing next to this grave. And, no, he did not deface the grave or anything, but he was just close to it. But probably just not an area you want to do anything like that in an old church. So right after he, finishes urinating on the side of the church, we are starting to walk towards the front, and this pickup truck pulls up. And this guy just shouts out, and he goes, "Get the F out of there now." And then just kind of pauses for a second and drives away. So we're all laughing. We just thought it was kind of funny. So we go inside the church, we're walking around. And then, we come out and we're looking over the hillside because we're like, oh, hey, it's around Halloween time. maybe there's a satanic cult or something meeting in the woods. Maybe we can hear something. Don't end up hearing anything. So we start walking back towards the church. It's up on a hill. You have to walk down this hill and probably at least a good 1,500 yards, if not farther, until you even make the wood line. So we were far enough off that we didn't walk down the hill, because as you walk down the hill, you go into the main part of the cemetery. And some of the girls that were with us, they were scared, so we didn't want to go back in. So yeah, once we start walking back towards the church, the pickup truck pulls back up from the other direction, and you just see the window come down, and here comes the barrel of a shotgun outside the window. Doesn't fire, and then he again yells. He's like, "Get out now!" So we run kind of like catty corner to the church, like towards the wood line, like we're going to hide. And then once we see that the guy finally pulls away, we're like, all right, this is our indication. We need to get out of here. This is where it gets interesting, because as I'd mentioned, where my friend went to relieve himself, there was this kind of tiny grave right by the church. If you look at the grave, it actually had the name of a child on there. And if I remember correctly, this child couldn't even have been a year and a half year old when the child died. So we walk the quarter of a mile back down to the car. Windows are fogged up and everything. On the back of the car, on the rear windshield, there are baby footprints on the rear windshield. And I'm just kind of in disbelief sitting there like, whoa, like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, there's no way this is possible. Because I'm sitting there thinking like, okay, maybe, maybe somebody stopped and like did something on the window or whatever. But like, there were no markings. Like, you could see drops from the rain like making its way down, so you could see that nobody had really messed with this window, and they were perfectly placed like baby footprints on the back of this window. So like me, I hurry up and I just clear this window off real quick. I'm like, everybody get in, and we drive off. So I just thought it was completely insane that, one, like I had known that grave there. Like, I remember looking at it, and I'm like, well, maybe I'm second guessing myself. Maybe this just isn't true. Maybe this is, just some weird anomaly. But we ended up going back like a week later in daylight, and I looked, and sure enough, it was an infant grave.
That's creepy.
It
So
was
did you get a good look
insane.
at the guy in the pickup truck, or was it kind of too dark to even make out anything?
The only thing I could see for the guy in the pickup is he had like it had to have been a trucker hat, but it looks like a trucker hat. But you couldn't really make out too much detail on his face, because where we were by the church, the only thing that was really reflecting was just a faint of moonlight that was, trying to come out from the clouds because it had rained earlier. But there's not too much you could have really seen like inside the truck itself. Like I said, I saw like an outline, and it looked like a hat. But after he yelled, like I said, he barely paused a second, and he drove off. And that's what made it interesting the second time, because like I said, like the window rolls down this time, and the way he's coming back was he was driving the other direction on the way back, and on the way back, the driver's side window just happened to be on the side of where we were at the church. So when you see the window come down and you just see this barrel, and you can tell easily it was a shotgun. And then we're like, all right,
Wait,
go.
that's
And
terrifying,
we
man.
just took
I
off.
mean, is that church completely abandoned, or is it a historical site?
So I don't know if it's an actual historical site in the registry with the state of Pennsylvania. It is owned by the county now, and it's funny because I don't live in the area anymore. As you know, I haven't been there in almost 7 years, but they've completely changed the gates of the church to really try and keep people out. Because again, like when I was growing up, this is what kids did. They went to this church, and they either went into the church, or they went over the hillside and they just messed around, or you may have kids doing drugs in that area. So they really actually redid the fence. And because the main gate going in was just a bar that you put up to keep cars out, but you could walk right in. Now there's actually, if I remember the picture right, I think I saw it about a week ago. There's a full-fledged fence like blocking people from going into the church, unless it's during certain hours of the day where people can actually go in and like visit the grave sites.
I see. So I want to circle back to these rumors of cults like using the woods and the church. Like, have people seen evidence of actual satanic worship within the abandoned church? Have there been news reports, or is it kind of hearsay, or did you see anything yourself?
I have not personally seen anything myself. This is all real hearsay. So that's why I say, legend has it, story has it, because my sisters are a couple years older than me, and they used to go out and they said they've seen people in the woods doing things, but also, too, that could be just to scare us. So I haven't had conversations with them in years about going up to that place. But for us, it's all just been hearsay. We all say it's an urban legend. So yeah, it's just stories being passed down. Um, you can probably go online and look up to see if there's new news articles or anything. But basically, the way that we all looked at it was like, this is all either myth or urban legend. And if stuff like this happened years ago, it was probably before a lot of us were even born, or even way before that.
Right. So probably something related to the satanic panic if we look far back enough. But I want to come back to the thing that like keeps sticking in my mind is this guy in the pickup truck coming back, telling you guys to get the F out of there. Then he comes back and points a shotgun at you. You think if he was trying to be helpful, he wouldn't be pointing a gun at you. But it makes me wonder is like, what is in that church that made someone so aggressive that wanted you guys out of there?
So the way that we always kind of discussed this and figured out maybe what was the reasoning is because the locals may just get tired of people going up there and just, acting a fool or being disrespectful. Because I will tell you, the area that this is in, it is more, even though it's kind of it's a town area off of a major road, but also, too, there are some very country folk in this area as well. So the way that I always explained it was, or the way I took it, was these are just locals getting sick and tired of kids coming onto private property and potentially defacing, a historical building or defacing someone's grave. Because you never know, like this person who could have been driving back and forth, they might have, history dating back to somebody being buried in that cemetery from the 1800s, and maybe they're just being protective. So that's always the way that I kind of looked at it, but it's really hard to say. One of my friends even mentioned that, oh, well, maybe it was just like a figment of our imagination and this was like a ghost vehicle or something, which I kind of thought was extremely ridiculous because it all seemed very real to me. But, people have had their theories, but the way I saw it was just a local just kind of protecting a private area in his hometown.
Yeah, that makes the most sense to me as well. But the whole footprints on the car, man, that's just baffling to me.
It was the first time in my life that I've ever experienced something like that, or at least that I could recall. I've always thought in years past, like when family members had passed away, that, I was always scared to go to sleep after a family member would pass away or I'd be at the funeral home because I just thought like maybe an apparition or a spirit would visit me, but that was just all in my mind. But this is actually the first time that something physical happened and I saw, and again, like I couldn't explain it because you could clearly see it was literally perfect infant footprints. There were five little toes, even two. I mean, you're not going to get the full outline of the ridges or lines in the bottom of a foot, but like you could see the little lines in these footprints. And I'm just like looking at it and I'm like, all right, I just got to erase this all together because this is wild. And if you think about it now, like where we are in 2023, I just could have pulled out my iPhone and I could have took a crazy picture of this. But back in, this was 2004. We know what our cameras were like at that time on cell phones, if they even had cameras. So we probably would have got this crazy blurry picture that didn't even look like anything. And then all it would have been was just this like what's whacked out picture that we would have tried to, bring to life years later or try to optimize, but who knows if that would have actually did anything. But we weren't in an age even back in 2004 where people just think to stop and photograph things. And it's funny that I say that because as you know, I'm an avid listener to podcasts and I listen to a lot of Bigfoot podcasts. And the first thing people ask, well, why didn't you take a picture? And they're just like, well, I'm just in such awe that I was seeing something that I didn't even think about pulling my camera out. And this is exactly how I equate this situation where I wasn't even thinking. I was just in awe and shock and like, what is going on here? And I just want to get rid of this and get the hell out of here.
Yeah, that does tend to happen more often than not. And it has happened to me before, like where you think you see something and there's an instance, I'm not going to get too far off track with the paranormal here, but where I was walking with my mom and we saw these lights in the sky that were following us all the way to the house. It was super creepy. And we had cell phones, but no one thought to record or take a picture. So I get where you're coming from on that front, with taking a picture and the fight or flight mode kicking in.
It's funny you actually say that because I've had two instances where I felt something similar has occurred where I've seen strange lights or it looks like an object in the sky, and then all of a sudden it disappears. But I mean, these were like one was when I was 10 years old, another I was probably barely 12 or 13. So I'm right there with you. And even if you would think about it at the time, again, the technology just isn't there from what we have now with cell phones and camera specs to we could even think about doing something like that. And let alone trying to think out, hey, let me pull out my disposable camera here and try to get this picture of what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Like when it comes to the paranormal and the supernatural, however one you want to title it, it definitely brings up our fight or flight mechanism where it's like, okay, I've never seen this before. It makes me uncomfortable and I want to get the hell out of here. I don't want to deal with this anymore.
And I think that's how most people are now. And I think we've been so accustomed over the last 10, 15 years because, if you look from a paranormal standpoint, you have ghost hunters and ghost adventures and all these shows to where, you can see this stuff being recorded or whatever's going on. But again, place yourself in that situation. You're not used to these types of things. And I think you exactly pinpointed it right there. It's fight or flight. And in most circumstances, if it's something that we can't explain, you ain't going to be able to fight it. So the next best case scenario is going to be able to say, hey, let's just take off and remove ourselves from the situation.
Yeah, speaking of those ghost shows that they have on Discovery Plus and the Travel Channel and stuff like that, it's like while they are fun, I personally think they do more to discredit the paranormal than they do to promote it.
It's interesting because I remember being in college. I was really into Ghost Adventures. Watching Zach Bagans and his team go and do what they do. And looking at it from, let's say, a 18, 19-year-old college student to being a 36-year-old adult now. it, I would agree with you in the sense that I feel like it's done more harm than good because I feel like that it promotes a lot of people to want to go out and just fake a lot of things. And again, I'll kind of equivalent it back to a lot of stuff I listen to, whether it be cryptids or Sasquatch or whatever it may be. The stories that you hear is the more and more of this that's reported, it does a lot of harm for some of the research or some of the evidence that's trying to be brought forward because the more you expose something to the general public, the more they want to try and fake it. So that's where you see, like, okay, let's go out in the woods and create fake footprints, or hey, let me go get this, Hollywood costume and let's act like we're a cryptid running through the forest, and but we're going to make the video really blurry and then we're going to submit it on YouTube. So I feel like from that standpoint, the way I look at it is I agree with you. It does more harm than good because then you're more likely to find coaxers, hoaxers, and a lot of this stuff being faked.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, man. But I want to segue into another topic that you shared with me for today's show, a ghost train. What's up with that, man?
This was interesting, and I mean, there's not as much excitement that goes into it, I would say, as in my first experience. But again, and it's really funny because all three stories that I have related to paranormal or apparitions or whatever, they all happened during my senior year of high school. And the second one was, it had to have been, if I remember correctly, it was either March or even right around this time, my senior year of high school. And we used to go down to some of the state parks, out in the woods and out towards some of the rural counties. just to get away and, get out into the woods or go hike and whatever. And yeah, I don't think this will give away too much of a location, but we were out in Somerset County and just in the absolute middle of nowhere, in between a couple of parks and a river. And we're driving on this it's this remote back road. I mean, we're driving for miles and miles and miles, and all you see is either road, farmland, or dense forest. So we're coming off this crest of a hill, and we're coming down, and you can see the railroad tracks from, probably a mile away from where we saw it. So we're coming down the hill. There are no railroad signs that go off or anything to indicate it's just a crossing in the middle of nowhere. But we're just kind of driving, and we decide to slow down the track because we kind of saw a faint light off in the distance coming through the woods, or out of the woods, I should say. So we stop and we're like, all right, we'll see if there's actually anything coming, because I mean, I grew up around abandoned coal mines and rail lines a lot of my life. So I'm always interested to see, hey, are trains actually still running in these areas? So it was me and a couple of my buddies. We get out, and you can just see this faint light, and it's kind of bouncing a little bit like something's moving, but you don't really hear like a train engine. But you do hear like this whistle. It was like a very faint, like woo woo, like it's the train whistle to indicate something's coming. So we're like, okay, like let's wait to see, this train coming through. We'll see how big it is, what it's carrying, whatever. But again, like we're not seeing anything, and the light's like barely moving. Like you could see it coming a little bit, but it didn't seem like it was going anywhere. And then, but again, you hear just this faint train whistle, like woo woo, but it didn't sound like it was getting closer. So we're just standing outside of the car before we're on the rail track, on the train track, and then all of a sudden, this light just goes away, like it fades. So we're like, okay, like maybe somebody was just walking the tracks, or they're out in the woods doing something. But then looking back at it again, like the light looked like it was higher up. It didn't look like it was right on the rail line, like somebody walking. But even after the light went out, again, you could hear this train whistle go. It went, I think, one, two times tops, and then it was gone. And it didn't fade like it was going away from us. It just stopped altogether. So it was very strange in the sense that I'm like, all right, maybe we're just crazy, because maybe, somebody lives far enough down that way and there's some lights, and maybe something came on. So we got back in the car and we started driving and just kind of investigating a little bit. We drove on a couple different roads within about a 10-mile radius to see if there were any other rail lines going through. And there were no other rail lines we actually encountered in that area outside of the one we passed. So for this, I'm like, man, we just heard a ghost train, or we saw something. We couldn't explain it. There was nothing else in the area. Again, like we're in the middle of nowhere, so who knows? Sound can travel pretty far. I've been on the Appalachian Trail, and I've heard from a military base 30 miles up mountain, gun or not gunshots, but like exercises going on. So who knows? It could have carried. But for me, like I honestly cannot sit here and explain and say we heard a rail line from somewhere else when we drove around for like 10 miles in different directions and we saw
I mean, the
absolutely
fact that
nothing.
you saw the lights and you heard the whistle, I think that gives some credence to that there was something there. What year was this?
2000, and this would have been spring 2005.
2005.
Yep.
So that completely rules out anyone using an app with a Beats speaker to mimic a train noise and using a giant flashlight.
And even too, so it's funny because in the fall of 2004, when we had the experience at the cemetery, we were doing a Halloween party at my buddy's house, and there's actually a train tunnel not far from his house, and we're all walking through the train tunnel, just kind of walking up and down the tracks, and all of a sudden, like we see this giant light pop up, and then you hear this giant horn go off. What it ended up being was my friend's dad got up on his friend's shoulders, held this light up high enough to look like a train, and they actually set off an air horn. So it was funny because I instantly thought back to something like that. And I was like, well, maybe somebody's just hoaxing or whatever. But then you look at it again at the same time, we're in the middle of nowhere. This is a very rural area. Why would somebody just be high up in the trees holding a light and doing faint train whistles? Like, this was a very different circumstance compared to, back in the fall, their dad was just trying to scare the crap out of
Yeah, for
us.
someone to actually do that out in the middle of nowhere, you would really have to have pretty much nothing to do with your time if you're going to wait for cars to pass by and pretend to be a ghost train.
And you don't even, I know for me, I never heard of too much about that stuff. I'd only seen stuff on TV. Like, the first thing that popped into my mind was, I believe it was Ghostbusters, but correct me if I'm wrong. I believe there was a ghost train in Ghostbusters that went through. And I'm just thinking about something like that. But again, that's what you see in the movies or what you see on TV. You can hear stories from the Old West that if you go out to Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado and Utah, you hear stories like this all the time. But in Pennsylvania, it's a little bit of a different story. And the interesting part about it is as I start thinking about it more and more, after this happened, I'm like, what if this used to be an old coal line where trains used to come through? Or maybe there was a coal accident, like maybe a train derailed 100 years ago coming through this area, something like that. So, that there could definitely be a lot of explanations for it. But, at the time, I was just so perplexed that, hey, in the middle of nowhere, like out in the middle of these woods in this rural county, that there's just these lights. And then all of a sudden there's these faint whistles, and then everything just disappears without a sight of anything within miles and miles and miles.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the potential of that being an old coal line and there being an accident or something like on those lines, like with those two whistles going off. It was probably a train alerting some people before something happened. And it makes me think back to a podcast that I did with another guest of mine, my cousin Chris, where we actually talked about the concept of residual energy and residual hauntings, where it's like, okay, why are certain places haunted over and over? Like, is it a transformation of energy, right? Wouldn't like you be able to move wherever it wanted? If this is making any sense to you, I feel like I'm explaining this horribly.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. And the reason why is because, again, you and I are historians. We go to Gettysburg hoping that we experienced something. And remember, this was not even a year ago, back in the fall, when we went out to Gettysburg. I don't know if I'm saying too much, but you're not supposed to, we weren't on the battlefield, but we were on the road, past dark, and we're just going into pitch black and just hoping something happens. Because if you look at it from a residual effect, you want to look at areas of atrocities. The stories you hear is people were trapped in these realms, or people were trapped in these areas because something so dastardly happened to them in their lives that they just can't get away from this area. So, you can equivalent that to the Civil War with all the sightings and visuals that people have throughout the city of Gettysburg, or even on the battlefield, or areas like Antietam, for example, or even again back to the Old West. If you go into saloons and brothels, people have stories of, old prostitutes or old gunfighters that they just see, that they're just there and they're not bothering anybody. They could be sitting in a chair, or they could just be at the end of the hall, but it's repetitive action on the apparition's part that this happens on more than one occasion, because something so dastardly happened to them either at the time of their death or during their life that they just cannot leave these areas. So it makes complete sense that, an old rail disaster could have happened, and this was the train going through and doing its nightly run before, it derailed or before some explosion happened.
Yeah, that makes sense, man. And I want to touch back on the Gettysburg thing that we did. I think it was in the fall of 2021 when we went back out. It was myself, you, and Will. We decided, hey, let's go back out there. It was already fall. It was the end of October or something, and it was already pitch black, and it was only like 6:30. And you saw how uncomfortable I was.
Yes.
We were driving through there, and dude, I don't know, like we stopped at a couple of places, and it was like, okay, we got out the car, we walked around a little bit. You and Will would walk around further away from the car. but I just kind of stood by the car. I just felt so uncomfortable. I felt like now this could have been my mind playing tricks on me, something subconscious, like me wanting something to happen or just my imagination running wild, but it felt like we were being watched and not in a good way.
Yeah, and knowing you, and I'm not sure if you've shared this, with other guests or even just on the podcast in general, but I mean, you yourself have a history of being pretty aware of something being in an area that just seems uncomfortable, and not being able to explain it. It could be an apparition, it could just be something with a paranormal presence. But knowing you and hearing the stories that you've told me, you certainly have those feelings. And, I could tell you were uncomfortable as we were standing there. And, none of us were really talking. But you could just get that sense because even for me, like I don't think I have that intuition or that feeling, but just being there gives you this sense of I don't even know how to explain it. It's like sadness. It's something bad is happening here. It's just this negative energy, which, and I've shared this with you before, but when I visited Appomattox a couple years ago, I just became overwhelmed with emotion because thinking about just the end of the war for the Civil War and what occurred there. There were not battles there at Appomattox Courthouse. There were ensuing battles on the way and even days after. But it just seemed like the levity of the situation and being in that area just almost like takes its emotional toll out of you. And you can really get that sense of the gravity of what had happened even hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, and when you go to those places, I don't know about you, but for me, when we go visit these places, like when we went to Antietam.
Antietam, the bloody lane.
Yeah, to Antietam, like I can't explain it. There were people taking the tour and they were walking on the places where the dead soldiers were buried, and I refused to do that. I just couldn't do it. Like they're like you said, I feel things, and for those of you that are skeptical, it is what it is. But nobody that has these experiences should have to defend what they experience. I hope no one ever has to experience or see the paranormal. It's not something that anyone should look forward to or want to experience, because I know there's some people that actually, go out looking for these things and want these things to happen to them, and it's not pretty. But to continue with Antietam, when we were out there, it just felt so eerie, even though it was in the middle of the day. Like, I refused to walk on Bloody Lane where the soldiers were potentially buried. It just felt wrong to do. And whenever we did have to do that, I was just so uncomfortable when it felt like I was being watched again. I mean, I can feel things. I don't see things. There are people in my family that can straight up tell you, like, there's someone standing right behind you. And I'm thankful I don't have that ability.
I'm right there with you. And I know we share, the same perception of doing things like that. So at Bloody Lane, and even Will, same thing with Will. Will refused to walk right in the crevice of how the Bloody Lane is formed. All three of us walked on the banks. We did not walk in the middle until we got to a.
And Will is a skeptic, by the way.
Yeah, and it could have been even the sense that he might even sense you were uncomfortable and maybe the gravity of the situation hit him. But I could tell even with our experiences, I think Will has an appreciation for what happened at these places, and he's very respectful. And I think that's where we all align because even too, again, go back to Gettysburg, go into the National Cemetery there, the Gettysburg Cemetery where Lincoln did the Gettysburg Address. People walk up and take pictures of these graves of people they don't even know. And they're standing like right in front of the headstones. And for me, and again, people might think I'm crazy, but for me, I think that's extremely disrespectful. Even my own relatives, I will stand off to the side of their headstones when I visit because I feel like that I should not be standing right on top of where their remains are. But also, too, like, I don't want to be posting pictures online of other people's families' headstones or somebody from the military. Like, yes, I understand the gravity of the situation, and it's nice to share because you're showing you were at this place and, it was a cool experience. But I mean, even too, like, again, I listen to a lot of different podcasts. If you listen to podcasts and hear paranormal stories, there's even stories of people taking pictures in just general areas like saloons or in cemeteries where attachment occurs. And this is just through a simple picture, and it's not how it's just unexplainable how this occurs. So even stuff like that, really just freaks me out. But for me, I always just get weirded out by walking even in the vicinity of close to being on top of a grave, let alone wanting to take a picture of anything, just because I feel like that, there's a lot of disrespect that goes to it, but also too at the same time, I just feel it's odd, standing over the remains of especially soldiers at Bloody Lane who, were fighting for our country and, died for such a cause that was going on at the time.
Right, yeah, and then you got people taking pictures and stuff like that, and you got your one buddy pissing near an infant's grave. And back to, I'm glad you brought up the attachment point, because that is one of my biggest fears. I will go somewhere, and wherever it is, they will realize, like, hey, these two can sense us. Let's get out of here and let's follow them.
100%.
Yeah, and that's not something that I want to happen.
100%. And I'm with you. And you and I have had these discussions about doing, battlefield ghost tours. As cool as we think they're going to be, we're like, man, like we're also scared to get out there and worry that something is going to attach and come home with us. That's a big worry I have. And this is probably subject for another podcast or something else, but the same thing goes for Ouija boards. Listen to other podcasts. Like, you and I have both listened to the confessionals, and I've heard stories on the confessionals about people doing Ouija boards, and within 24 hours, they have an attachment that attaches so bad that they have to get an exorcism. So like stuff like that. Yeah, man, I'm 100% with you on that. And the fact that, I worry about the same elements or any form of follow, attachment, whatever just may occur, because you never know what this stuff can actually do.
Right. And you don't know what type of entity it is. You don't know if it's a spirit. You don't know if it might be something demonic. But speaking of Ouija boards, I have a strong dislike for Ouija boards. And I have a strong dislike for the companies that sell them as board games. These are not board games. And for those of you that believe, these things can open up portals that you can't close. Just because you said goodbye or whatever, that doesn't mean it's gone. The worst thing that you can do is open up a portal. And I've lived in a home that I would say like was haunted, for lack of better terms. And it was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. I said this on another pod, so I apologize for repeating myself. From up until about 16 years old, I was a straight up atheist dude. To me, if you talk to me about spirituality, religion, God, I always throw back at you, well, if God exists, why did the Holocaust happen? Or why did this thing happen? Yada, yada, you name it, I brought it forward to you. But then I started having these unexplainable experiences, and it's like, there's something there, and if there's something paranormal, something else has to exist along with it, but I'll digress from that.
No, I agree with you. You just never know what's going to happen. And, I grew up Catholic. I actually grew up in a specific denomination. I was Byzantine Catholic. And, again, these are just separate topics where you could just have discussions about, old world versus new world, what's taught in religion today versus what was taught in religion when we were children. But, I grew up kind of with an Eastern Orthodox background where the Old Testament was taught to us. And we did hear about the Old Testament during liturgy, where now I feel like the Catholic Church and a lot of different denominations completely stay away from the Old Testament because they feel that they're scaring people away, or they don't want them to see the bad side of what happened in religion. But for us, I think it's important to be able to understand all that. And, we were actually taught about, stories of the devil and demons and just different things that, aren't really talked about in traditional churches. So from that standpoint, as you get older, you become curious and you start learning about these things. It starts taking you down rabbit holes, or you go on searches for different elements, and you just never know, is there witchcraft associated to a Ouija board? Can you open up any portals by working, with certain types of I forget what they're called, but I guess like magic balls or that people look into to be able to try to tell the future, or even too simply just you know telling ghost stories in a cemetery, or even not even playing on a Ouija board, but I've even heard stories on podcasts of people just having it in their possession and opening it up and not doing anything, but then attachment occurred. So you never know what can really happen, whenever you start delving into these things. It seems like it's all fun and games, but I don't think people will understand until it actually happens to them.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we are reactive to and we're not proactive as human beings. We tend to react to certain things when they happen as opposed to proactively avoiding them. But there was one thing that you mentioned in your email to me that you wanted to talk about, an abandoned psych ward, and you said you actually saw an apparition in that psych ward. So what was going on there?
Yeah, so again, this was all within a year span. This was my freshman year of college, so this would have been fall 2005, again in the same area where I grew up, not far from my hometown. There's this abandoned psych ward that has been abandoned since the 60s at the latest, but if not the 1950s. And this place wasn't really blocked off. There was a fence around, but like one side had a wooden fence and you could easily just walk in. The doors were never locked or anything. So, we used to go into this place and just kind of explore around. Well, one night we went up again. It was sometime maybe early October, I believe it was. It was a clear night, not overcast, like the moon's out. It was just a really nice, brisk night. And we're walking up to the side of this abandoned building. And, we're just kind of joking around. And, I'm just kind of looking, just kind of getting the lay of the land, figuring out, is there anybody around? Are there cops around here? Are we going to be okay to go in? And I just happened to look up. And this building, 3 stories, if I remember correctly. But I just happened to look up in the one window and you could see curtains flapping around. Why there were still curtains up, I have no idea. It's very interesting. But for me, I could say clear as day, you could see a female figure standing there at the window and not looking down at us, just kind of standing at the window, just staring straight out, this blank stare. Um, couldn't really make out any details other than like you could just get an outline of it and you could almost see flowing hair. So like I'm looking and it seemed like it was probably like 15-20 seconds, but I bet it was probably no more than 5. And all of a sudden like this figure's just gone. And I'm like, guys, did you see that? And they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, did you not see that up in the window? Were you not looking up? There was something there. They're like, oh no, you're crazy. They're like, there's no bums here. There's no homeless people here. I was like, I'm not talking about bums. I was like, I'm not talking about physical people. I'm like, did you see this like figure? And they're like, no. They're like, no, you're crazy. And I'm like, I'm telling you, I saw what I saw. So, of course, then I start questioning myself. And at that time, we'd never gone up to the 3rd floor. The farthest we had ever made it was the 2nd floor, because the 3rd floor, if you go up the stairwell, it was actually being blocked off by old bed springs. And we always just got this weird feeling that like, okay, this is blocked off for a reason. We should not go up here.
Right.
But, I was like, guys, like I'm not crazy. I'm telling you, I saw what I saw. So one of my friends said, listen, I'll go up, I'll go stand in the window and we'll see what you saw. So my friend goes up, makes it up to the 3rd floor, and he's kind of shouting down. He's like, is this it? And pretty much is positioned right in the middle of the window. And you could see, like, for me, I saw the clear difference versus a physical human being and an apparition. And for me, there was no doubt that there was just this apparition standing in there. And I told him, I was like, I can see you clear as day. I can see your movements. Like, this was not a physical being. And so, like, again, they just all kind of wrote it off. But for me, like, I feel like I know what I saw because I could almost see right through this. And the reason why I say this is because of those curtains. You could see almost clear as day through this apparition, the curtain right behind it, and see the movement of it. And then all of a sudden, this figure is just gone. So I just couldn't believe that, again, I'd never seen anything like I had the experience with the footprints a year before, but now, like, this was my first experience of, for me, seeing an apparition or actually seeing some kind of being that was there. And it just, for me, it just looked like it was just this lonely person just staring out the window, like they just wanted to get away. And for me, I was like, maybe this was an old patient who was just, maybe they were just like so comatose that they just stood at the window and they just, had blank stares and didn't know what was going on. But yeah, it was really interesting in the sense that, I just happened to look up and there just happened to be this apparition there. And then, like I said, 5 seconds later, this thing is just completely vanished.
Yeah, that completely makes sense, man. Because if you think about a psych ward that has been open since like the 19th century, and I think they started closing them down in the 60s and the 70s and 80s, right? The horrible things that they used to do to these patients, these innocent people that just had some sort of mental ailment or some sort of illness, lobotomies, like people would sexually abuse them, they would kill them. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if that apparition you saw was probably one of those lost souls that unfortunately lost their lives in that place.
And that's the way that I took it too, was again, something so horrible happened to this person in the place that they died, that this is their resting place, and they just keep revisiting. And the rest of the building alone is creepy enough. I remember, if you enter on the first floor, you go downstairs like you're going into the basement, and we never went into the basement, but clear as day, written on the wall, and you could tell it was spray paint, but it was just always in bright red, like it never faded. It didn't look like people were coming back and just writing over it, but it just had an arrow pointing down that said, "This way to hell." And like, for me, that just always stuck out. It's like, okay, like maybe people were doing that to scare people from staying out of it, but it that place always just gave me such a weird vibe. And I feel like that is one of those places where you could be in there and you could encounter a lot of entities that just couldn't escape because they were mistreated so horribly, or they were just so medically induced that they were comatose until that they were eventually, succumb to whatever they were going through. Or even, you hear stories of old penitentiaries where people were just beaten to death, and their spirits just stay in those places. You could have people beaten to death in these psych wards as well, because they were not common people.
Right.
They had mental illnesses, and people don't understand mental illnesses like we all have the knowledge of it today. And this could have been the same instance of, that person who I saw up in the window.
Right. All those negative stuff that happened in those places, I think it does draw negative entities that could potentially be holding those people back from passing on. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. But I had a couple of more things I wanted to ask you. I added this one while you were talking, and I think you know where I'm going to go with this one, dude. You want to care to explain your tattoo and that experience and how I harassed you before you got it and told you not to get it?
So so we talk about, of course, possession and attachment in these areas. So 2022, this would have been early 2022. I already have my upper arm tattooed, but the same arm on the lower portion, I am getting a sleeve completed. And the whole story behind my sleeve is it's almost resurrection. So the bottom of it actually has a Norse demonic entity that is just this demonic figure. It's all black in the middle. It's got this cut up cloth, and it actually has horns coming out of its head. And then there's fire surrounding it. Well, I was telling you, of course, that I'm going to get this done, and you were just joking with me. You're like, "Hey, man, you're going to get this done, and then all of a sudden you're going to have weird stuff happening. You're going to have creepy stuff happening." And then even too, I remember one day you saying like, "Hey, you never know. Watch out for attachment, whatever's going on." So I'm just like, all right, you're messing with me. This is funny. Ha ha ha. Quit trying to scare me out of getting this done or whatnot. So funny thing is I got this done in February of 2022. Well, that night it was surprisingly warmer than what it usually is in February. So I had my window cracked just a little bit, and I always close my bedroom door when I sleep, but the apartment I was in at the time, the bathroom was connected to my bedroom, so I always left that open. The window was like I said, it was barely cracked because I didn't want to get too cold in case the temperature dropped. But it was a little bit windy that night. But for me, I don't think there was enough wind to really cause any disturbance in my room. Well, all of a sudden, it was deadbeat 2 o'clock on the dot in the morning. All of a sudden, I just hear this boom, this loud slam. And I jumped up and I looked over and my bathroom door is closed. So instantly, as soon as I jump up, I turn all the lights on, I turn the TV on, like anything I could get to shed light on what's going on because it really freaked me out. And I'm looking around and I'm, looking at the window and the shades are moving a little bit, but again, nothing too crazy. So I get up and I just go check and it's barely cracked. So instantly I just crawl back into bed. I'm freaked out and I'm just like, that son of a bitch, Chris. I was like, this is his fault. I was like, I really started like, hey, I think something might have happened here to where, because of my arm, it was literally not even 24 hours since I'd gotten the tattoo. It was that night. But thankfully, since then, nothing has happened. I haven't had any other instances. I lay it down just to be a coincidence, but you really got in my head with that one. And then all of a sudden, 2 o'clock in the morning, that happened. That happened to happen.
Yeah, man. Thinking about that entity and using that, your tattoo as an example, what, well, I'm not trying to scare you, but I think what might have happened was you getting that tattoo might have, I don't know, been a way to summon that entity because it called back to a time where that probably would have been a form of worship because back in antiquity, they used to do tattoos and stuff. So it could have been a form of worship or acknowledgement or like idolatry, right?
Yeah, it makes complete sense because even to, if you look at, and I think I'm saying this correctly, but religious iconography, it could be pictures, it could be drawings, it could even be verbiage, it could be, yeah, that's it.
Idolatry.
That's exactly it. I think I said iconetry or iconic. I can't remember how it's exactly
Iconography.
iconography. Yes, that's more related to pictures in itself. But there are certainly stories of and I think you and I actually had this conversation about something similar. I think I like to go to yard sales and look around at stuff. But I remember telling you, I think you guys were looking for a new mirror. And I told you, I was like, oh, hey, go to a yard sale or something. You're like, I'm not buying a mirror from a yard sale. You never know what's in that thing. So, I think of things like that, and which again could be 100% true because you never know where that mirror is coming from, or it could have been in a house that had possession or something that was going on there, and you never know if that actually carries over with it, or if something actually leaves when that item leaves a specific place, like a church from like the 1500s, for example, or if that entity would actually stay in the house and it just happened to be in a mirror or an object.
Yeah, there's a common, I want to say myth or superstition that mirrors hold energy, both positive and negative energy. So I'm of that belief. Funny true story. My wife and my mother-in-law went to an estate sale and they came back with a mirror. And I said, no, get it out. And I was dead serious. I was like, I do not want this mirror in this house. They ended up throwing it away. And it only cost like $5, but the point still stands.
I believe it 100% because again, this is not really a story, but just something that I'll mention here. One of my friends from high school who I grew up with, her grandmother actually, the basement used to be an embalming room in an old funeral home of the house they lived in. I don't know how mortuary scientists or morticians can live above a funeral home. It boggles my mind, but um, there used to be a story that the grandmother told that in the one bedroom and it's the story of Bloody Mary, that if you go into this mirror in the bedroom, if you say Bloody Mary 3 times into the mirror, a woman appears. And her grandmother swore up and down, never deferred from her story, the same story each time, but it actually happened to her at one point. But it just happened to be in a mirror that used to be in an old funeral home above where embalmings occurred in the basement of the building.
Hey man, I have one final question for you before we wrap up today. From your beliefs and the way you understand things, what is your understanding of the paranormal? Like, are we on different, like, is it like different? Do you think it's different planes of existence? You know, there are things that we can't, like, there's an entire another world you can't see. So how do you conceptualize or reconcile this with your beliefs, I would say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's for me, it's a little hard to explain. I don't necessarily take it on the religious side. I actually take it on, and I think supernatural is the wrong word, but it's how I can best describe it. I think that we just have these dimensions where, and I'll use family as an example, and I'll tell you a quick story. And again, this could be a whole other discussion or topic, but my gram passed away in 2019. The night she passed away, I deal with sleep paralysis off and on. And the night that she passed away, I was laying on my side, woke up 2:30 in the morning, and I was just absolutely frozen, could not move. I was in a total state of paralysis, but I just had this sense that something was in the room, and I couldn't shake it. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't move. Like, if you're in sleep paralysis, I don't know if anybody listening has ever experienced it. You can't even scream, can't make a sound, can't do anything. But I just felt like something was there. And even though I was scared, I didn't feel like I was in danger. And I talked to my mom the next day, and my mom is extremely religious. So she wouldn't necessarily say that, hey, from a supernatural side, this is what occurred. But she was like, I honestly believe in my heart that was your gram there just coming to say goodbye to you. And she wanted you to know that she's here. And that's how I look at it. I've only had experiences, and again, I can relate it to sleep paralysis, that I just feel like it's around the time of when people pass away. And my fiance even has stories about stuff that's happened whenever family members have passed away or whatever. But from what I experienced, I think it's just this realm where people who are from another world want to interact with you because they just want you to know that, hey, I'm okay. Because even, I've had family members, die of cancer and different things, but I just feel like I've had times where I've just been like touched and said, hey, I'm okay. Don't worry about me. And that's really how I see it. I more see it from a supernatural sense than I do from a religious standpoint. Because growing up in the Catholic Church, everything's done in one way. So you're just kind of taught to believe whatever's believed. And I used to be one of those children that question everything. I would go to Sunday school or catechism and say, where did God come from? Well, God's always been there. Well, what do you mean he's always been there? He had to have come somewhere. He had to have a father. Like, he had to have been born. And at a young age, you just don't understand these things, but that's just how you're taught. Versus now, as I become an adult, my mind's been able to be open to read about other religions and learn about different backgrounds and find out similar stories from Hinduism to Christianity to Catholicism to, just all these, to even, Indian culture, whatever it may be. There's a lot of similar stories and similar backgrounds. So from me, I have a hard time tying it to a religious standpoint because that's just not how I was taught. I just more see it as these are just, and again, from my experience, these are just people who are keeping in touch with you from another realm just to tell you, hey, I'm okay. You're going to be okay. Don't worry about me.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of The Wandering Road. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and share with your friends. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to you joining me for the next one.